this computer. Righto, ready to roll. So you can all see my screen? Okay. Remember in the short lecture series, I don't repeat anything I did the week before. So if I'm saying anything which it's suddenly unfamiliar, go back and check the recording for last week. In the one on Thursdays, people here know anything that I cover, I try to background fully in that particular lecture. This is a bit different with the shorter course, but that's the way things have to be. So let's just get this thing to react to my mouse. Okay. So the issue, having talked a bit about the way neoclassicals think about money last week, the whole idea that money is a veil over barter and all that sort of nonsense. Let's now start with the question of what money is. And there are enormous divisions in economics over what should have been an accepted topic. It's a bit like, what is gravity? We're at a similar stage where we don't know what gravity is or what is energy. It's really quite an ignorant discipline in that sense. So you have a lot of people believe money is a commodity, or it should be. They believe money is being gold, and they regard the current fiat system as an abomination, etc., etc. It's totally historically wrong. And then the other group, which is the side that I'm part of, says money is non-commodity. It's not something that you can reproduce yourself. It's a promise between yourself and some type of entity which enables that promise to be held or makes that promise enforceable. Then you have the argument that money doesn't matter. And as ridiculous as it sounds, that is what monetarism taught. Milton Friedman's take on money was that money only affects the price level. It doesn't affect real output. It does only temporarily. And the more extreme versions of neoclassical now say that it doesn't even affect temporarily, because of course, we all have infinite wisdom, and we all know what the central bank's going to do, and we know the impact what the central bank is going to do. Therefore, money doesn't matter. On it goes. So that's the argument that money is a veil over barter. If you worry about money, you're suffering from money illusion, etc., etc. That's actually the mainstream position, which I think is horrific, but that's the way things are. The other argument is money does matter, and that's the position that I come from. And what I've managed to do over the last few years is prove that. So I'll be going through part of that today and a bit more next week. And this is one of the main distinguishing features between neoclassical economics and post-Keynesian. So if anybody's studied post-Keynesian literature, almost regardless of the specialization a post-Keynesian author will have, they will take money seriously. And there are particular people who specialize on money, and that includes Basil Moore and Hyman Minsky and so on. And of course, in recent decades now, modern monetary theory has developed, and that is compatible with, but not coextensive with post-Keynesian economics. And of course, that also argues that money matters. If I had to look at the most useful paper that I'd recommend people to read to get a perspective on what is a sensible analysis of a monetary economy, it's this paper by Graziani. So the link is there. You can't click on it during the slideshow, of course, but you can once I send the I've sent this lecture to you already, I think, so you can find this on the classroom tab in school. And what Graziani did is take a first principle approach to saying, what is a monetary economy? How do you distinguish a monetary economy from a non-monetary economy? And his simple idea was that a true monetary economy can't be using a commodity. This is quite a logical argument. Why? Because a money economy using a commodity is really a barter economy. It's a barter economy where you've specified one particular commodity to be the conduit for barter exchanges, but it's still it's just, rather than being an N commodity system, it's an N-1 commodity system where the nth commodity is money. Okay? So it's still a barter system. If your model of money has money as a commodity, you're not modeling money. I think that was a brilliant, simple way of cutting through all the arguments over gold, et cetera, et cetera. And so, well, that to be true, what you're using as money has to be something which is intrinsically worthless. The gold, of course, you can use for other purposes. Silver, cowrie shells even, to some extent. It must be something which only has a function of money. Now, the funniest example of that, has anybody here read David Graeber's Debt the First 5,000 Years? Good, okay. Well, you'd know in that he uses the example of these stones off the island of Yap, where the stones are about 2 meters in diameter, and several of them fall into the ocean, and they still use them as a system of accounting. So those stones can't be used for anything. In that sense, that is a non-commodity money system. So you've got no intrinsic use, and you can't make it yourself. And that gives you further conditions, therefore. The first is that it has to be a token, otherwise you've got barter. The second is that it has to be final payment. So it can't be an IOU. Okay? If you transfer an IOU to someone else and they give you a commodity in return, you still have a debt commitment to that person. And if you don't fulfill the debt commitment, they can take the commodity they've given you back. So that credit, in the sense, like, for example, trade credit, is not really money. Okay? It can be used to facilitate exchanges, but it's not really money. And the final condition, and this is Alwyn's discussion here on this point, I think on the that may be on the diamond site, but I think that was quite insightful. There's potential seigniorage for the government. Okay? The government does, in a sense, have seigniorage for itself. But if you're looking at a private system, and that's what Graziani is looking at here, the private creator of money can't use that to go shopping. Okay? If the private creator, meaning like a private bank, creates money, then it has to earn money before it can spend on its own behalf. Okay? So that's more looking at a pure credit system. And that's in many ways why I developed Minsky. I was looking for an explanation of a pure credit economy and how to bring money into it in a full sense. And Graziani gave me the idea of how to do that. So he said the only way to satisfy these three conditions is to have payments made by promises of a third agent, the typical third agent being nowadays a bank. And he said when an agent makes payment by means of a check, and he's writing back in the days before electronic money. So if you wanted to transfer from your deposit account to somebody else's deposit account, you had to write a check. Okay? So it's not like using cash for that transaction, though cash qualifies as well as a form of money. It's using checks for transfers when he says a paper money system. They said, now, once you've made that payment and the person's accepted the check, there's no further debt and credit relationships between you and the agent. So if the person who's accepted the check from you goes to the bank, tries to bank your check at their bank, and just let's say your bank then fails after the transaction has occurred, he can't come back to you and say, I want my goods back, because you have actually paid by transferring that promise. So it's something which, even if the conduit, your own bank failed, when you hand over that check, as long as you didn't know your bank has failed, you've actually purchased the good in the sense of exchanging money. So what this means is you don't get any sense of privilege by use of a paper money system. And he said there, and this is what I thought was just such a wonderful insight, any monetary payment must therefore be a triangular transaction involving at least three agents, the payer, the payee, and the bank. And that is a complete shift from what the neoclassicals think about money, where they have two agents, two commodities, no third party involved, and an exchange where relative prices matter rather than finances. So if you look at the neoclassical attempt, they model capitalism as a barter system. And in barter, you have two people and they've got two commodities. So person A has good X to sell, person B has good Y. And so you have two people, each with a different commodity, and the really important thing for them to do is to work out a relative price. That's the essential step in the neoclassical vision of exchange. And the numeraire in that case can be anything you like. Okay? And the main reason why you have money, in any sense, in that model, a barter model, they're not modeling a monetary economy. They're modeling a barter economy where a particular good is identified as the barter commodity. So that's the non-monetary side of their modeling. The only reason you do that is to avoid the double coincidence of wants. So X can, if you're going to actually strictly barter something, the person you're bartering with must have what you want and vice versa. But with money, you can sell X and get M. Now, M can be gold, cowrie, corn, whatever commodity has been chosen at the numeraire, and then you use that commodity to buy what you actually want. That's the reason that they think money actually exists. And that has been ingrained into neoclassical economists since Jean-Baptiste Say. And even though neoclassical economics only became intellectually dominant in the 1870s, you can find precursors of neoclassical thought, certainly in the early 1800s in France. So Jean-Baptiste Say and Augustin Cournot were both I'd call proto-neoclassicals. You can even find this stuff in Aristotle. Okay? So the idea of utility and barter and so on go back that far, and they've been wrong for that length of time. Now, if that's where you stay, if you don't make the logical leap that Graziani did in that paper, then you can't understand money. And they've trivialized its role. And I mean, does anybody here know John Hearn? I debate with him I wouldn't call it a debate, I monologue in two directions with John Hearn on Twitter. And he's John Baptiste Say with an English accent. Okay. And he says the most outrageous stuff, and he's completely convinced that it makes complete sense. So here's Jean Baptiste Say in what he calls his Catechism of Political Economy, explaining why money doesn't matter. Every producer asks for money in exchange of his products only for the purpose of employing that money again immediately in the purchase of another product. For we do not consume money, and is not sought after in early ordinary cases to conceal it. What is this guy smoking? Thus, when a producer desires to exchange his product for money, he may be considered as already asking for the merchandise which he proposes to buy with this money. It is thus that producers, though they have the air of demanding money, do in reality demand merchandise for their merchandise. Now, if you swallowed that particular blue pill, you're never going to escape the matrix. But that's what they've all done. So it's objectively nonsense. But if you fall into it, then your brain cells get rewired to believe this is a description of the real world. Because people do want to accumulate money. There's no way that Bill Gates and Elon Musk is an unusual example, but Jeff Bezos, they want the money, they want the power, and they do conceal what they've got. You need Freedom of Information Acts to find out what people put in as tax returns, and they don't immediately purchase a product after it. If you imagine that was happening with Bill Gates, I saw a calculation that I'm including in my next book. Given his wealth in about 2005, if he consumed at the rate of $1 million a day, he'd take about 50 years to run his money down to zero. That's assuming no other money comes back in. So of course he'd never do it. So Marx is much more realistic here with a wonderful phrase: accumulate that is Moses and the prophets. And his argument is that the capitalist does not want use values. They want exchange value. They want monetary power, monetary capacity. That's what spurs them to act. And they're bent on getting as much money as they can. And this is actually Marx being praising capitalists, because he says he ruthlessly forces the human race to produce for production's sake, and that what forces the development of productive forces over time. So the progress we've made in technological terms from the 1800s to now has been largely motivated by the desire to accumulate money by capitalists. So it's not entirely, it's partially negative, but from Marx's point of view, this was why capital had a creative role to play in the growth of capitalism over time. Accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets. And then what you get is they're trying not to spend, but to save as much as they can. The whole idea that there's an equality between their income and their expenditure is just wrong. So what you've got with, say, is this proto-neoclassical world where nobody wishes to accumulate wealth and power. So it's a system of petty commodity exchange. It's not capitalism. But this is what neoclassicals think they're modeling when they build their highly elaborate DSGE models without money. So Graziani's perspective transcends what I see as a complete caricature of money amongst the neoclassicals. And it makes banks and money and debt, of course, a critical part of capitalism. So rather than having a two-person, two-commodity, relative prices, and money is just an intermediary, you have three entities: a buyer, a seller, and a bank, one commodity, and the sale is monetary. You exchange a monetary token for the commodity. That's real capitalism. And our modern day, what you're doing is transferring bank liabilities. If you pay from your bank account to the seller's bank account, what you have as a liability the bank goes down. What the seller has as a liability the bank goes up. That's what actually affects the transaction. And then in return for that, you get the product. So what you get is a triangular view of capitalism. And I really found this quite a revelationary exercise when I first read Graziani back in 1997 or 8, I think. And I would highly recommend reading the paper. Do not bother with the mathematics. He gets caught up in equilibrium thinking, makes several mistakes as well. The maths is irrelevant. It's just the logical argument that matters. So if you have buyer and seller both operating in Bank A, then you have a money transfer from the buyer to the seller, and the seller transfers the goods. That'll happen inside that particular triangle. But if you bank at one bank and the seller banks at another, then there's another triangular relationship between the central bank and the other bank. And this starts to give you an explanation for the clearing exchange function that central banks have, which they're about to lose in Argentina. So that's Graziani's insight, and that really is what inspired me to create Minsky. And that's why I would say, please do go and download, have a play with it. It won't bite. It is, I think it's fairly user-friendly. Doesn't crash anywhere near as much as it used to. It's probably more stable than some Microsoft products these days, frankly. So, and if you want to then follow the logic of monetary creation, it forces you to think in double entry bookkeeping terms. And that will give you a really, really deep insight into the monetary system. So the essential thing that Minsky added to what is called system dynamic software is the Godley table. And that's the basic structure of a Godley table. You have each of the accounts from a particular entity's point of view is shown as either an asset or a liability. The gap between assets and liabilities is the equity, whichever entity the table describes, and every operation has to occur twice in each line, and the operation must guarantee that the sum of assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero. And that's what the final column is doing there. So if you look at a buyer and a seller, then you have, and they're in the one bank, or you're looking at the aggregate level of the banking system, then if they're going to be selling a widget, there's a minus sale dollars per year from the buyer's account and a plus sale dollars per year going into the seller's account, and that sums to zero. Now, at that point, the bank is still effectively being an intermediary, because to actually be an active agent in the economy, it has to be creating or destroying money. And that's what happens. Imagine if when you went shopping, you went shopping with your credit card. So what happens, first of all, in that case, and it's almost instantaneous, is you swipe your card, the debt you have to the bank goes up, you momentarily get the spending power of that money, and then that's transferred out of your account into the seller's account. So your debt goes up, which is an asset of the banking sector, and the seller's account goes up, which is a liability of the sector. You can see it as a two-stage operation, and that's fundamentally happening all the time in a capitalist economy. And this is an intriguing statement by J.K. Galbraith, one of my favorite writers, and his son is one of my favorite people. Jamie and I are good friends. But he actually got it wrong. He still believed the money multiplier model. So what he said, he's quite right about it. Say the process by which banks create money is so simple that the mind is repelled. Where something so important is involved, a deeper mystery seems only decent. Imagine nuclear power, how complicated that is. Money is just double entry bookkeeping, and it's ridiculously simple. So you start with two accounts. If you imagine a bank being formed, it has to have positive equity. One of the conditions to be a bank is you have to have assets which are greater than your liabilities. In that case, you have positive equity. You have to prove that to become approved as a bank. And the point here is that banking is both a particular interaction with capitalism, and it's also part of the legal arrangement with the government. But the government, whatever region you're in, has to first of all approve of you that, yes, we accept that your assets exceed your liabilities. So that's absolutely vital. There's liquid assets too. There's several definitions of being insolvent. There are people who would know more about that than I do. But in Surrey Bank, its short-term liabilities must be less than its short-term assets, so it can cover its liabilities completely. There's no danger of it failing. And it has to maintain positive equity, otherwise it goes bankrupt. So my favorite example there, I think I mentioned it, I'll talk about this a few times, Hank Paulson, when he was Treasury Secretary during the global financial crisis, got a call from his successor. I think it was at Goldman Sachs. It may have been Morgan Stanley. I get my octopi mixed up sometimes. Or vampire squids, pardon me. And the new guy said, "You've got to do something or we're going to go bankrupt." And Hank Paulson asked him, "How long have you got?" And the answer was, and I quote, "about 3 hours." Okay. Well, that's how fragile the liquidity issue is. So if you imagine starting out as a bank, you would have $100 million, or that's just a random figure there, but $100 million as assets, and with no liabilities, your equity is also 100 million. So that's where you start from. So that's where reserves can be created by deposit from the public. In this case, the public is a group that's forming a bank. And the main form that'll take is an account that the bank itself has at the central bank. It can also include vault cash and things like that. And the main thing, though, for the central bank, as well as being part of the legal recognition that you are a bank, only banks or the government get an account at the central bank at the moment. The main thing is you can use that for settling your accounts with other banks. So I regard this like oil in an engine. It doesn't enable the car to move forward, but it stops the engine freezing. Now, deposit accounts. The reason that banks want deposit accounts is if they have deposit accounts, then they can, by their own decisions, in concert with anybody they're lending money to, they can manipulate both their assets and the liabilities. If you're a non-bank, you can change your liabilities around. Your assets may change in value, but you can't change them independently. So the main reason why the bank wants it, not because they want people's money in to lend out, it's because with the capacity to create money by increasing liabilities, they can also increase their assets, which is how they make money, literally. That's the key reason they need deposits, not to lend them out again, but to be able to increase assets and increase liabilities at the same time and create money. Without being a bank, you can't do that. So that's the essential reason you want to be a bank, because you can be what's called a non-bank financial institution, like a building society, and they can swap assets around. They can move money from bonds to reserves, or bonds to deposit accounts and stuff like that. But when they make a loan, they reduce its bank account and they increase its loans. The bank account is an asset of the building society. The loans are an asset, but it's swapping where the assets are. It's not changing assets and liabilities on its own. So that's, with the banking license, you can create an asset called loans, and you do that by adding the same sum, which would be credit dollars per year, to the asset and the liability, where the liability is the deposit account of the person borrowing. So that's how you create money as a bank. And that's why the double entry thing is so important. I didn't understand double entry bookkeeping when I first invented Minsky. I was doing single entry. Sometimes I have 3 entries on the one thing. I've learned this from building Minsky. Now I'm quite arrogant about it, because I reckon I know double entry bookkeeping pretty much better than anybody on the planet. And that's because by having built Minsky, my brain is now wired to think in terms of double entry bookkeeping and transfers and so on. So if you're saying making a loan occur, you have loans which are an asset of the bank and deposit which are a liability. You put credit dollars per year into each. You increase both loans and deposits by credit dollars per year, and the increasing of deposits by credit dollars per year is creating money. So and this was, again, one of those insights which comes out of building the software and then using it on a regular basis. And it's why I strongly encourage you all to download it and play with it yourself, because as you do that, even if you make mistakes, you learn from mistakes with a tool like Minsky. So don't be afraid of it. I get quite a few people having an obvious fear about getting their feet wet by downloading and putting a number inside a spreadsheet. It's just a spreadsheet cell, guys. You did that with spreadsheets 30 or 40 years ago. Do it with Minsky now. All right, yeah. So the fact that you can make an operate to create money for the banking sector's point of view, there is a difference with cash money. But an operation has to affect both the assets and the liabilities or equity side of the banking system ledger. Any operation that doesn't do that does not create money. And that clears up an enormous amount of confusion about whether the government borrows from the banking sector when it sells bonds. Okay. Does that have any role in creating money? No, because they both happen on the asset side of the banking sector. So that's very, very, very deep insight you get out of playing with Minsky, except for, as I said here, for the case of notes and coins. So you start off in this situation where the bank have positive reserves, and that's out of the creation of themselves as a bank. Loans, which is how they increase their income earning capacity. Deposits, which are required to be able to increase their income earning capacity, and then their equity, which must be positive. So you start from here. If you imagine making a loan, you're getting credit, increasing loans and deposits by credit dollars per year. And then because you've made a loan to someone, they owe you interest payments. And there's a transfer from you, from the public, from the non-bank public, from the deposit account to the bank's equity. Is your dog enjoying the lecture? Very, very cute to see, Poncha. So that's the fundamental, and that's what Galbraith thought he was. Galbraith is quite right. It's actually even simpler than he thought it was, because he's still stuck with the myth of creating money by money multiplier. So there's many more issues than that. I think really recommend a very short little blog post by John Carney some years back, quite a while now, where he says loans create a lot more than deposits. So if you made a loan, it may also then necessitate you to change your reserves, and it may necessitate you to raise more equity. So it isn't simply as simple as that, but I tend to work on that just to model the macroeconomics more accurately. You could set up a Minsky model where you had all these various cascading dynamics flowing through from creating money in the first instance. So what I've got, and the reason the model's incomplete is I did it there, and we had this discussion with JP a few weeks ago. Why can people borrow money from the bank and pay interest on it, even though they don't get the money for the interest from the bank? It's because there's a flow back from the banks back to the non-bank public. So I put that in here. I've got credit dollars per year being created by the bank, interest being paid from the deposit accounts to the bank's short-term equity, and then the bank spending out of its short-term equity on the non-bank public, which can be paying salaries, paying for computing services, buildings, janitors, etc., etc. So what you do is to model this, and this is where you can learn a hell of a lot just using the double entry bookkeeping side of Minsky. You don't have to model to understand a lot of things that it will teach you about the monetary system, but to actually link it in with monetary dynamics and then to see the impact of changing variables, you have to define relationships on the canvas as well. So the simplest way to build a model of a monetary economy with dynamics and turning over time is to bring in Milton Friedman and imagine you've got a stock of money times the velocity of circulation. And then what I do as well as that, I say, well, the bank will be spending based on what's in its short-term equity, which in some ways the short-term equity for a bank is a bit like your deposit account. The amount of money in your deposit account will, to some extent, control how fast you spend. And certainly in the aggregate, you can generalize that people in social classes spend based on how much money they've got in their bank account. So what you get out of that, and that's just showing a little model down here, you have to bring in a parameter, and I showed a bit of this last week live with the lection I'm building the money multiplier model. You type a parameter on the canvas, so interest underscore curly brackets rate close curly brackets gives you the entity, and then you can say it's a parameter which will turn its color blue. Parameters can't take inputs, but they do have an output. So you then have an interest rate, give that a value like 5%, multiply that by loans, and I'm actually looking on the wrong screen over here. So you have interest rate of 5%, loans are 700, interest is $35 per year. So Minsky's doing that calculation even before you start doing a simulation. Then you have bank spending based on what's in the equity account. I use what's called a time constant here. That's a very common concept in engineering. It's like how fast does a spring respond when you hit a speed hump in your car? Okay, it's a very important question to know. You don't want to respond too fast, because if it does, you'll get a very strong shock. If you respond too slowly, you won't respond to hitting a bump, and your car will scrape the bump. So there's a time constant that determines how fast a spring responds, and the same thing applies here. So I've got a time constant of 2 years. That means with $70 million in the bank spends $35 million per year. That's sort of calculation. And then I've got deposits plus bank equity added together, giving you the money supply. So 730 in deposits. I've changed the values by running a simulation here. I started with 730. And actually, I've ended up with 730 and 70 in bank's equity. That becomes the money supply. Multiplied by the velocity, you get GDP. And then I have credit being a percentage of GDP. So credit the percentage parameter times GDP becomes credit creation. And then by playing with this, I've changed the amount of money in the economy, and by Jove, I've changed the GDP. Now, there still remains the point of me showing that it is not just change in the value of money, it's also a change in the actual amount of economic activity. So I do that in next week's lecture. But what you've got is a beginning of showing that money matters for macroeconomics. And it's simple to model this way versus the nonsense that neoclassicals do with their so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which have them pulling their hair out doing algebraic equations before they can run any form of simulation. And they do that in a dreadful text-based program called Dynair, which you've got to learn how to program to do anything in. They're working as hard as Hades, and they think, oh, if we're working hard, it must be science. No, you're building epicycles, okay? You're pre-scientific. That's what they don't realize. So I've got debt in dollars per year, interest and debt in dollars, interest in dollars per year, and the sustainability of the system is because the GDP and the income you're earning in dollars per year enables you to pay the interest bill in dollars per year. And I think I showed that a few weeks back. That was maybe in the Diamond course, I think, with JP. So that's it. Let's have a bit of a chat. I'll just stop sharing the screen here, and I'll check the chat.
Sorry.
Yes, Pedro Poncho.
That last chart, it basically tells that you increase credit, GDP goes up, right?
Yep. And what I'm going to show next week, again, what I'm doing with these lectures is dividing the course into small chunks. So if you're in the mastermind course, I cover about 3 times as much in each lecture, which is why you'll see a promo turning up, by the way, in the next couple of days from Jordan. He's doing a Black Friday sale. And in fact, what he's offering is like $100 for the $500 course. And when I look at it in terms of what that means is for buying it, the price of the lectures falls to about $5 a lecture, which is where I want the price to be. So I want that sale to succeed. So do take a look at it. I've tamed down his marketing a hell of a lot. It won't make you puke. It used to make me puke when I first saw it. So do take a look at that. But yeah, so I'll go in next week. I'll explain logically the credit is part of aggregate demand and income. And that's very powerful. That it shows that as soon as you move from the world where you imagine banks are loanable funds engines, then you get a world where bank money creation becomes part of aggregate demand and income. And of course, it's also part of asset market dynamics. So it's a major change in how you think about the monetary system.
Yep. A question. I don't know if this was discussed because I joined late. Based on Graciani's 3 conditions of money, Bitcoin would be considered money, no?
No.
Why not? Not that I'm for Bitcoin.
In 3 conditions, let's see. It's a token. You can't use it for anything else. That's true. You can create it. Now, that's partly like, you've got to be lucky. You've got to go and buy yourself a few GPUs and burn large amounts of energy. So you can make it. In that sense, it's a semi-commodity. So I'd still argue that it's not money. But the main reason I'd say that is that what they're trying to do is have a token which is an asset for the owner and not a liability for somebody else. So that takes it outside the realm of double entry bookkeeping. And I would argue that it's a hybrid commodity. It's not really the same sense as like a money token in a bank, which is fundamentally nothing else you can do with it, particularly like a check. When Granny was talking about checks. Audio gone. Alwyn, are you not able to hear us? Let's see. Okay.
No,
sorry.
It's a historical comment.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. So I'm ambivalent about Bitcoin. I just basically see it as a virtual tulip. That's my attitude to it. But it's lasted longer than tulips have, or did. What do you think? You want to come back at me on that one?
Well, I was just going by Graciani's 3 conditions, and I just it seems like it would fit that description.
I think it's
I'm
probably like a rough
Right.
edge thing because, like one thing is it's an ordinary commodity. He says a commodity which is something anybody can make for themselves cannot be money. Now, Bitcoin, sort of, you can make it yourself if you want to go and buy a server farm and get involved in all the trying to build, get a nonce, a random set of random zeros, and then get the reward. So it's hybrid.
I guess it's not a token, right? It's more a commodity like gold because you have to mine it literally.
Yeah, that's right. That's an analogy.
Yeah.
The analogy, if you look at what whatever the person who created it was thinking, then yeah, it's like a gold mine. There's only so much gold. It's physically limited. There's a scale. I mean, the funny thing about it on the other side is almost infinitely divisible. There's 21 million Bitcoin, but you can have, I think up to a millionth of a Bitcoin. So the idea is that as prices as production increases, the price, the size of the unit you're using for something to buy thing would fall. So it's got a deflationary side to it. And people also, of course, love it because it's increasing in value, which is part of the deflation. But that's where that crazy acronym HODL come from. I said, what does that sound? HODL? Hold on for dear life. It means you don't use it for transactions. So, you have a so-called form of money which you're not using for transaction, because if you buy a pizza with it, you forego a Rolls Royce in 30 years' time. So nobody buys with it. So in that sense, I think it undermines the nature of money. And this comes down to people often give three definitions, three characteristics of money: a means of payment, a record of value, and a record of transactions, and a store of value. Now, people get my arthritic fingers don't help there. People get obsessed on the store of value side of things and criticize normal money for the lack of a store of value. And they say Bitcoin's so much better as a store of value, but that undermines the first front. If it's a store of value and it's going to increase in value, why spend? So that to me is the fundamental flaw with Bitcoin.
Thank you.
Any more?
More questions in the chat there, Steve.
Oh, pardon me. I have to take a look. Let's see. Yeah, okay. Let's see. What's the motivation for neoclassicals to consider misunderstanding money and capitalism? Very good question. I think it's because neoclassical economics describes a utopia. And the utopia, humans are very easily seduced by the idea of a perfect world. The old questions about what do you think it is, looking up at the stars at night, you then explain it being based on the gods and Zeus, and explain the sun being dragged across the sky by chariots, and you get belief systems coming out of it. And we've all experienced, and I think this is an important aspect of humanity, we've experienced the feeling of freedom, relatively, and the feeling of being confined as well. And like being confined, nobody actually enjoys being told what to do. But sometimes being in a society where people agree to do what's said by a central authority can be more powerful. So, your empire defeats another empire because your soldiers are better organized, et cetera, et cetera. So I had this tension all the time between freedom and control. And the beauty of the neoclassical vision of capitalism is it's a system with no power. And I think that appeals to people. It's like a functional anarchist society. And I think that's a major reason why they like it. And they don't realize that they're anarchists. Well, you keep on talking, but let's get Jose's question. We'll come back to that one. Jose, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, why was this so unknown, the double entry bookkeeping? I mean, wouldn't accountants at banks know about this?
They've known about it for centuries. But economists, because they said money doesn't matter, they've never learned the framework of double entry bookkeeping. Like when I went to university, I did an arts law degree, which I did. I didn't do the straight economics degree. And when I went through, if you did economics, you did economics, obviously, in the first year, 1 unit of accounting, one unit of statistics and one unit of something else. So you got taught accounting, but accounting was all this stuff about credits and debits and so on, and it felt very mechanical and stylized to economists, and a lot of them just didn't like it, hated it, in fact. And finally, they got rid of it, so you don't do any accounting at all
So,
when you
so
do
are
an
you saying
economics degree.
that the economics degree, or like the whole economic studies, is like broken into different parts, like economics study this and accountants do this
That's
instead?
right.
Like,
What's your intellectual background? What's your training?
I've done a semester in economics. It was macro and micro. And
Yeah.
right now I'm studying system development, like computer system development.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the
Because
computer system. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
after listening to you and like having that one semester, I felt very disappointed with the education.
It's dreadful stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, see, as a computing person, you know more about accounting than economists do. You've got to build ledgers, transfers. You're doing that all the time. So in that sense, the idea of a balance, so your things going from a source and from a source to a sink, is part of where you're trained. So and you have to use it practically all the time in designing computer software. So but economists, it's in this abstract, arbitrary world where money doesn't exist and where you're maximizing utility and you're trying to minimize marginal cost, all this sort of stuff. So it's actually a non-physical vision of the economic system, and but they think they're being mathematical, they think they're being scientific, but they've done a whole set of original assumptions that rule out a link with the physical world. So
I remember when I did this first semester, this one semester, a few of my classmates actually asked how much we will talk about money, because they didn't want to talk about money, because I don't know, they have this idea that money in itself is a dirty thing or something like that.
Yeah, money's a veil over barter. I mean, and like and this partially if I look back at my own training, because I swallowed this stuff at high school, and then I got halfway through first year and I had a lecturer's driver bulldozer straight through my acceptance of the theory, which I would be forever grateful to him for doing that. But when you're caught up in it, it really is like a vision of a perfect society, because the argument is everybody gets what they call their marginal product. So therefore it's a meritocracy. You get paid what you're worth. They have no power. They talk about perfect competition. So with perfect competition, nobody has market power. The government, if it comes in, makes things worse. So you actually become anti-government and anti-union. And this is the new Argentinian president is a product of that way of thinking about the world. So it's going to be fun and games in Argentina shortly. But yeah, that ideological appeal of a perfect anarchist society is what I think sucks them in. And there's actually a guy who I got sick of him. I tolerate a lot of garbage on Twitter, but he was a bit too much for me. A New Zealander guy who's a believer in all this neoclassical stuff, and his blog title, and I quote, is "Utopia, you're standing in it." In other words, you're in a utopia. What are you complaining about? Look him up, Cliff. He's one of your countrymen, you poor bastard. So how do changes in public debt fit into the relationship between private debt and GDP? I'll cover that in more detail, Simon, in a couple of lectures' time, because what you have is another form of money creation. So, and it's become obvious to me over time that when you have governments obsessed about reducing their own debt, that actually drives humans into the private sector into speculating. Because as the government creates money in a different fashion at the private banks. So private banks create money by increasing their assets and liabilities simultaneously. And of course, when that happens, there's no change in the bank's net worth, and the people who are borrowing have no change in their net worth either. For every dollar they get a dollar of debt. So there's no change in the net worth in that case. But the government, when the government spends on you more than it taxes on you, the gap increases your equity. But on the other hand, for that to work, the government must go into identical negative equity, and that's negative financial equity. So when the government spends more than gets back in taxation, it's creating net financial liabilities for itself, which are net financial assets for the non-government sector. And they're precisely equal in magnitude, opposite in sign, equal in magnitude. Now, if you get a government that's obsessed about, oh my God, we're in too much debt, we've got to reduce it, that is going to tempt the government to tax more than it spends, which is what they have to do to reduce their recorded debt, reduces the positive equity of the non-government sector, and will often inspire non-government actors to borrow money from the private banks and speculate on the value of shares and houses, which are non-financial assets. So there is a very strong link between the two, I think, in a logical sense. When I look at the data, it's screamingly obvious whenever the government gets obsessed with reducing its debt level, it effectively sparks an asset bubble in the private sector, which later leads to a crash. And the Great Depression fits that pattern. So does the global financial crisis and the Panic of 1837. So governments think they're doing the right thing by reducing their debt, but they actually end up forcing, in a sense, the non-bank, non-government private sector to speculate and gamble, and that gives us financial crises. Yeah, Argentina. I'm glad I'm sitting outside to watch what happens. If he abolishes the central bank, then they lose settlements between private banks. I hope he isn't crazy enough to go that far, because from their, I mean, they don't. This is back to Jose's question: why they hate money. There's such a hatred of the thought of a monetary system that they don't even learn in a intrinsic sense as you would to build an accounting system, a computerized accounting system. They don't learn the whole idea of settlement accounts. So to some extent, they're not even aware that that's the major function of central banks. So yeah, it's going to be a shit show. I'm just glad I'm on the outside. And Tony's asking about money and power, both political and academic. But what you mean, why the banking sector, why the government's leaving the banking sector out? Is Tony still here or is he gone? Oh, yeah, pardon me, Tony, I can see you on the screen there. It is certainly for neoclassical economists, ignoring money sort of makes them important in a weird sort of way, because they end up being the unintended defense of the banking sector. So the banking sector would be quite happy to have neoclassical economists obscuring the financial system, because that lets the banks do what they want. How's that?
Yeah, Milei, the new Argentina president, he was saying that he will dollarize Argentina's economy because of the inflation problem. Is that a way to solve it, make it worse?
It's
Does it matter?
potential, because it suddenly means there's a reference point that is fixed. But it also means you've got to be getting the dollars into the country, which means you've got to be running a trade surplus. Now, I don't think Argentina is doing that. So that could cause, that could cause deflation. And then by people be dropping their prices to try to get dollars in through their door rather than elsewhere. And if they have outstanding debt, that deflation can cause a financial collapse. So,
I mean, there was I don't know if it's still on, but it was illegal for a while to exchange more than X amount of pesos for dollars in Argentina. I don't know if it's still in place, but I remember, because I'm from Paraguay and I live in Paraguay during that time, a lot of Argentinians, what they will actually do is they will bring their pesos illegally to Paraguay, and Paraguay is very unregulated. There is no control of basically anything, so they will just change their money to dollars and then bring it back to Argentina.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's still in place, but yeah.
Well, look, I know I had a hassle getting out of Argentina about 15 years ago when I gave a talk there. I had to wait until the banks reopened so that I could actually exchange the pesos I got paid by the central bank to buy an air ticket out of the country. So, yeah, it's going to be fun. I mean, Ecuador isn't the country I've been to. It's actually dollarized, and that was a similar attempt to fight inflation, and it works. everything's stabilized. But they were rigorous about maintaining at least a trade balance, if not a trade surplus. So if Argentina doesn't have it, then I think it's going to be forced to have a massive reduction in income to sustain that. Otherwise, you're going to be importing more than you export, and then you run out of American dollars, and then you haven't got a currency system. So it should be
Steve,
exciting.
Could you elaborate? Yeah, Steve, sorry, could you elaborate on how the dollarization would cause deflation?
If you are having, like, if the dollars are leaving the country, you're running out of dollars all the time. You've got to earn them. You can't buy them because you don't have pesos anymore. So to earn them, you've got to have more dollars coming in, or at least as many dollars coming in as are going out in imports. You've got to have a balance of trade. If you don't have the balance of trade, then the money supply is shrinking. Okay. So therefore, if you want to get somebody to buy in your shop, you're going to be going, oh shit, I've got to drop my prices to attract people in. Everybody does the same thing. You get general deflation coming out of it. And then if you have debt at that stage, particularly if the debt's now denominated in dollars rather than pesos, then you can't pay your debt and you go bankrupt. Exciting times for Argentina.
Like,
yeah. Any more questions? Have I answered most of the questions there? Or discussed them? Okay, all right. Look, I better think of heading off because I've got to fly out to the country tomorrow and doctor's appointment, all that jazz. So I'll see you all next week. And tomorrow there's no class, by the way. That's because I'll actually be flying at the time. So I've made that note. I'll remind you again before I leave Budapest tomorrow. So thanks all. Good to chat to you, and see you again next week. Bye.
You.
so
Bye.